Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to our next session of Rebellious Research Seminar Series with Louis Nette from Ravensbourg University. I'm absolutely delighted to have him here with us tonight. I said to him before we officially opened this session that we have lots of filmmakers here, but this seminar series is certainly not about filmmaking only. It's about all different types of creative practice research. So I'm so delighted to have you here tonight, Louis. And the talk of our presentation today is Drawing is Not Enough: The History of Drawing as an Act of Conjuring, Narrative and Witness, and Why It Still Matters in a Hyper-Mediated World. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, if it was not stopped already. And the next hour or so is yours, Louis. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Let me just get this here. So thank you so much, Agata, for this opportunity. This is this is great. It's wonderful to speak to other people who are working in the kind of field of practice-based research. As we all know, it's quite an emerging thing. Even if it's like trying to catch a cat, perhaps. So it's kind of always shifting. And when you talk to people about arts-based research or using practice-based methods as a method of inquiry, people just sort of look at you a bit kind of confused, especially people in the sort of serious research world. But in reality, as we are becoming increasingly more illiterate globally, images matter more than they ever have been. And in some ways, people's sophistication, although it might seem counter what kind of privileged image makers or kind of sophisticated people supposedly think, there is a real, because of such a wide swath of images that are being received into people's eyes and minds every day, there is a growing level of kind of sophistication in terms of the expectation of the image and maybe even an understanding of how the image functions. This is a kind of strange byproduct of perhaps reading less or maybe reading in a different way. But drawing is this kind of humble artistic practice which has been around probably the longest. It's possible that maybe somebody kind of drew a sort of face in the sand before they maybe painted on a kind of cave wall. But drawing and using kind of primitive materials, which they still are today. I use graphite, which is basically sort of a dirt stick on a piece of paper, which is not, that paper is not that far off kind of parchment that was used thousands of years ago. So it's a very simple technology that's utilized to kind of create drawing. But what drawing is and how drawing has kind of told our story as human beings for thousands of years is really quite remarkable. And the way in which people are still utilizing drawing to try to kind of connect to, actually, in some ways, humanity, utilizing essentially hand and eye and sort of tools, simple tools, but also perhaps probing what it means to be living in a kind of modern world, utilizing such kind of primitive materials, which is also a kind of another layer of interest that we can explore here. But what I want to start off doing is really to explore what happens when we draw and how we actually receive a drawing. Because in order to understand how a piece of media might function as a piece of research or as a tool for research, it's important to understand how that thing, the artifact, the thing that is occurs after we do a whole bunch of lines and so forth, what that thing is, what a drawing really is, how we understand it, how it's made up, and so forth. One of the things that is maybe a bit different from drawing to photographic and filmic media is this nature of time and how we experience the drawing being of the subject and about the subject, but also pointing to other aspects of time. I am here, I did the drawing, I was there, I did witness the thing, or I was there in my own imagination. But at the same time, it holds these two spaces in a way which is quite unique. So we'll explore that in a moment. Oh, just trying to. Ah, here we go. So, drawing, as opposed to maybe filmic photos and filmic kind of media, is an ecstatic refutation of kind of time's rot. It can date. We can look at a drawing and we can say, okay, this is really old. They've used old materials. This is old subject matter. There's a sort of lady in a medieval hood or something like that. But when we receive a drawing, when we look at a drawing, we're always reenacting what we see in front of us in the moment, of the moment, and kind of about the moment that this work was created. Because we're also encountering media as basically as sort of visual learners, in the sense of when we're looking at a piece, we're actually trying to kind of decode its construction. We are having a momentary experience of unpicking the meaning and the and coming to an understanding of what the image is actually about. So a cohesion of the observed, the psychic, and the felt, a kind of an accounting of one's whole self at the moment of creation. This is another thing. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about whether photography has a language, a vernacular, but certainly drawing does. And that really kind of comes from the physiognomy of the artist, the total person, their neural networks, their who they and how they feel, if they're tired, if they're hungover, if they're ecstatic, if they're relaxed. All of those things come into how that particular drawing is made on that particular day. So it's a summation of the person at the moment of its making, moment of the drawing's making. If you want inspiration about drawing, sometimes the sort of dead old white men master's idea of Western art is actually stupid and is narrow and confining. However, Rembrandt is one of those true masters. When you see his drawing, there is something actually magical about it. There is a level of kind of observation and tenderness and humanity that is remarkable. And one of the things that drawing creates is a kind of symbolic self-sufficiency. And what that really means, and this is Rawson, Philip Rawson wrote really the first theoretical analysis of drawing as a whole in his book called Drawing. And really, he really starts to unpick and understand drawing as a language, but more than a language, as to what drawing does. And drawing basically kind of creates another world, or as he calls, a realia. But the self-sufficiency is that every drawing creates a visual language that has a logic unto itself, and it has rules, and there are certain lines that are reference to things in observable reality, that they have a specific function. And the spectator, the viewer, us, we create our own mode of truth. When we look at an image like this of the dog, we think about all the dogs we've ever seen. And actually, we come to amalgamate our experience of dogs with this represented dog. So this is an addition to our perception. So this is where drawing really starts to become more complex and more interesting, where we visually start to add this other language to our known language. If we're artists, our own observed language, our own kind of symbol, our own stockpile of lines and marks that we use to refer to the real or the imagined. And if we aren't artists, then we are seeing this as possibly pieces of a kind of magical emanation, that all these lines and marks actually become fur and they become soft and they have texture and they have meaning. In the total, we come to a feeling, maybe an idea or maybe just a sensation. So an understanding of drawing and formal language and its total effect, its effects on us and its aesthetic effects as well. So drawing enables us to align with the vision of the artist and all of the sort of overt, intentional, and then subtle subconscious things that are also happening in a work of art. This is important in terms of how we can start to see practice-based research utilizing art, but also the sort of rebellious nature of art, because what we're really kind of questioning is other notions of truth. We have seen it, we've documented, we've drawn it. There's a claim to truth, but of course it's also an abstraction. It's made up of multiple marks and lines. It can't be verifiable. So this rebellious part is also kind of is an interesting aspect to it, where it challenges us to consider what is true and what could be true. So early forms of drawing, this is particularly interesting as well, is that what they found when they looked at the caves in Lascaux in France was that the cave where the paintings were minimally disturbed. So in other words, it was likely that very few people other than the artist were ever actually in those caves, which scientists and theorists have been thinking about this and puzzling this out. And one of the thoughts that they had was, and also because of the location of the caves, very deep back, set back from the kind of main part of the cave, was that this was a site of ritual, that artists were shaman, that artists were kind of conjuring up images of actually what would be mostly kind of successful hunts. So they were using art and imagery to actually kind of predict what would be a kind of success for the community, basically. An abundant hunt, where everybody sort of fed and so forth. So it's actually using art, the magic of art, which is a magical thing, these things coming out of nothing, something from nothing, was actually a way of representing the future, creating a vision of the future that would benefit the community. So the other part to really consider with drawing is that representation is power. And we see that from the beginnings of kind of scratches and paintings in a cave to graffiti, to political posters, to political cartoons, to a whole variety of images drawn, that the artist can make new worlds and new realities, and the artist can make new claims to truth, whether those are accurate. We certainly know with propaganda that many claims to truth are very highly problematic. But before photography, the artist really is the kind of sole producer and reproducer of the observed and imagined world. Another thing that some people kind of forget is during the Renaissance, in this period, a lot of people are looking at the kind of Sistine Chapel and they're like, wow, this is just phenomenal. How can anybody sort of paint this? This is just incredible. But actually, early ideas around genius and early ideas around the role of the artist, keeping along this kind of lineage of this shamanistic idea of the artist that even potentially comes from this cave painting, although we don't absolutely know whether this was part of ritual. But this idea that the artist is a sort of special person in the world who can represent reality, who can create these things that emerge from nothing. This idea of the genius really comes from primi pensieri, which is the Italian word for first thoughts. So these first thoughts, these first sketches, were where the artist was working out ideas in preparation for the production of larger paintings, finished work, usually. Rarely, even for Leonardo, were these drawings ever thought of as an end unto themselves. They were all usually preparatory. But these preparatory drawings held a lot of power and particularly and a lot of importance for the artist. What's interesting is that there's an incredible amount of first thoughts sketches that still exist from this era. So thinking about this kind of origin, this sort of improvised kind of marks, these early observations and thinking about how to kind of replicate reality, solve problems visually. It's a very important part of how drawing sort of contributes to the other arts as well. And then we go to kind of the cartoon. And we think of the cartoon, we've come to kind of think of the cartoon it's become such kind of in commonplace. But actually early caricature really sort of emerges in a way out of nowhere. It's part of play, so it's part of visual play. But what we also have in the early caricature is this real dramatic shift in away from realism and towards stylism. And you could even really chart stylistic departures in modernism from early caricature, from the cartoon, from people playing around with stylistic ideas and aesthetic ideas that move away from realism. So early caricature was also produced mostly established artists by Bernini. And caricature was also used in commonplace areas like storefronts or maybe in front of churches, and oftentimes they were used to kind of scare the hell out of the public, because if they did something, if they stole a loaf of bread at the shop or if they sinned in church, there was usually kind of horrific, simple, crude drawings of terrible things happening to them. So this is kind of the strange story of early caricature. And Ernst Chris, quoted by Gombrich here, says that these drawings were closer to witchcraft than they were to art. So again, this idea of drawing, keeping on this rebellious theme, of course, that drawing is underneath it is this kind of subversive act, maybe so close to the human psyche that it's able to kind of capture it, that there's something verboten about that and something potentially frightening about that idea. This caricature as well is the first known caricature of an actual person by Bernini here, caricature of Pope Innocent VI. So here we have drawing, so a sophistication of drawing, unlike almost anything in the world, because sophistication, we assume, is the layering of more things. In art and design, as we often know, is that sophistication is also in reduction. So this reductive approach in drawing is where there's a synthesis of character through more limited means. So moving very far away from realism and into kind of almost kind of childlike reductive drawing. So its caricature is polluted by commentary and reflects the wider kind of bandwidth of human psyche. And so we can start to depict more than just the exterior. We can start to think about what people are kind of thinking, what are their intentions, what is their true nature, hence caricature. So, and there's a very moral, instructive role that caricature is kind of playing for hundreds and hundreds of years. A good example of that, of course, is Hogarth. So English should be proud of this one thing, which I would actually easily argue with a kind of French scholar, that the English really invented the political cartoon and really graphic satire. The French may have a few kind of stars in and amongst this field, but there's few who have the full wild expanse of artists like Hogarth and Gilray. Hogarth's Beer Street and Gin Lane are actually really pieces of propaganda. They were kind of commissioned works to really stop the production of gin, or the untaxed and unregulated production of gin, of course, in by creating this kind of contrast. But there's lots of funny nods to, and there's lots of funny jokes within each one of these. I mean, Beer Street isn't perfect either. People being perpetually drinking beer isn't always going to work out that well anyway. But Gin Lane is just like total chaos. Everything is going wrong. Baby's falling out of arms. The dog is looking like his next meal might be that guy who just passed away. It's just lots of horrible things kind of going on. The coffin seller is doing a big business, but there is this condensed narrative that's happening in graphic art in this era, which is really brilliant and really gives us this sense of how people perceived each other, how society kind of operated, and also how messaging and propaganda was really working and was effective in this time period. And indeed, it was effective because they passed the Gin Act after these two prints. You have to also remember that prints in this day were a bit like going to the kind of video shop if you're old like me. When you rented a video or something, and you went to the video shop and you kind of see all the things, you'd go and you'd rent a video. People would rent prints. They were mostly reproductive prints. You wouldn't really get or reproduced prints. You wouldn't get the original prints so much. But they were in a kind of window, so people would see them almost like they would be looking at the TV. People would be standing outside a print shop, looking at this work. So they had a very street level appeal, these works. Then we move to Gilray, who's about sort of 20 years later than Hogarth, who just cranks it to a whole nother level. And here we also have the kind of problematic areas of political cartoons and stylism and caricature moving into probably unfair depictions of the French amongst a variety of other people, but an equally fantastic skewering of the military classes, the political classes, the wealthy, and even really quite a kind of intense and honest look in the cultural mirror of what English society was and what it valued. So here, drawing is playing this kind of really elaborate and performative role of looking at society and unpicking and calling out its hypocrisies, really. So it's propaganda for sure, but because it's drawing, because it's this crazy thing called drawing, it's kind of anarchic. So the meaning, although the artist has intentions, has meanings, has kind of commentary that's embedded in the work, the meaning is still unstable and somewhat unfixed, because we as the viewer have to bring our own selves to it. We have to amalgamate with the kind of stylistic intentions of the artist. So all these performative qualities of the drawing shift our attention to wider ideas. So the drawing doesn't take us like a tunnel towards a specific destination. We're going off into lots of different ways. And then in some ways, this is the value of drawing as well, as a kind of artifact, as also an object of study, because even with a fixed subject, fixed rendering, it tends to point outwards. So the caricature is always about the extension of meaning, and getting distracted by the image, moving around the image, getting distracted by details and kind of different little articulations around the drawing is kind of the point. It's involving us. It's more of a kind of set piece than it is really just a singular drawing. So the cartoon's this amplified reality, and we're kind of enjoying all of the kind of bombast and wildness. one of my favorite quotes is this Ruskin quote where he says, a great artist must match the confusion of nature in his or her work. And I really like that. I think this kind of that artists like Goya, who's kind of like a cartoonist. I mean, Goya might not like me calling him a cartoonist, but it's kind of a cartoonist vernacular, really. I mean, a fantastic cartoonist. I don't think cartoonist is bad. Is a lowly designation, but yeah, it's this snapshot of our kind of interior world. But more maybe than anything else, do we really get a sense of how people were not just representing their reality, but what they were feeling about the times that they lived in when we look at this work. Goya's Disasters of War, of course. And W.J.T. Mitchell is a researcher I would recommend people to take a look at. I'm sure many of you here have looked at this, but one of the interesting ideas that he has is that the image becomes separated from the maker when it's kind of complete and starts to actually have kind of interest and intentions and a sort of drive of its own. It wants different things. So here he's really talking about the image like as a pseudo person, and when we look at a work like Goya's Disasters of War, this is particularly true because there's something so profoundly horrific about it that it also it becomes this implacable kind of like questioning of us. It wants to arrest us. It wants to kind of hold our gaze and force us to kind of to see this. And that's where the kind of that timeless aspect of art also works. We don't just see this in Goya's time. We start to think about atrocities now and so forth. So it has this kind of eternal quality about it. So moving on, the artists of moving into the sort of, well, 19th century is also Goya, of course, but later part of the 19th century, we also see drawing being, number one, drawing was the image of the news. So you have the Illustrated London Illustrated Illustrated London Weekly, I think. No, Illustrated London News, I believe it is. Was just that those were drawings, very, very detailed little woodcut engravings that were basically telling the stories of the day. But then we kind of move, because of technology, we move to the ability for artists to use different media. And with that, it's more freeing. So we're basically getting more kind of eyewitness accounts or more creative accounts. Like Doré, of course, was an incredible artist. And we also get more of a bottom-up exploration of society. So really looking at working class life, what cities really looked like, how they felt, how they functioned, and really when we really consider that in reality, these were places where people were doing a lot of manual labor. So by virtue of that, we're really looking at kind of working class society. This actually had an enormous impact on the Victorians had this very high estimation of themselves morally. They were very religious. They thought that everything that they were doing was kind of the God, the providence of higher spirits, and they were really, their contribution to the world was wholly good. So when they saw these images really reflected back to themselves, it had an enormous impact, and it did lead to questioning of some aspects of the structure of society, particularly the education of children. Daumier is also an enormously important artist doing the same work, but in France. And in some ways, we could say that the artist has this kind of moral vision and is this moral voice, but there's also an aspect to this where the artist is chasing probably the most compelling stories. And maybe this was more of the compelling story, actually, this kind of social fracture than maybe other things, where we knew that the Degas and all these other people were really drawing sort of middle class life and ballets and performances, doing all this fantastic stylistic and aesthetic moving of our collective vision. But at the same time, they were seeing there's this other story underneath all of that, which is perhaps even more kind of colorful and maybe even more critical. So yeah, this exposing the tension between industrializing societies and all this wealth disparity that we're seeing. And the other thing that drawing has too is, yes, there is this observation of reality, but the image is orchestrated. The image is constructed. And it's important to remember that. And there's also debate around this, around photography as well. Is the photography, does it have the language? Is it constructed? Is this reality? Sontag called the photograph atomic reality. But I think what she's also thinking there is the way that the photograph captures, you know, in pixels, or in the old days in this kind of like these small dots of light. In the drawing, however, the artist has to make decisions. He has to think of the sort of formal decisions that he's making, and they have consequences. They have effects. They have a way of contributing to our total understanding and formulation of meaning. Yeah, as it relates to the wider piece. Without a doubt, my favorite artist, and this is one of the weird ones because I'm very fickle and I go through artists and I go through interests like mad. Go through, you know, it's why, yeah, collecting various different things and then be like, actually, I don't really like that anymore. But Gross is really one of those heavy hitters, whose keen eye and kind of powerfully charged line also had an enormous impact on his fellow artists, but also subsequent artists have looked at his work and seen this kind of incredible merger between observation, rigorous observation, and kind of caricature commentary. He documented that the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War. So a really broken society, a really fractured society. He was himself also broken by his experience in World War I, as were his fellow artist friends. Although strangely, Otto Dix said it was the making of him, not ironically, which is a bit strange. But so I think Gross is a more interesting artist than Otto Dix, but we could talk about that another time. But so he eviscerated the society around him, drawing all these people. These were the people who, in some ways, he saw winning in a situation where everyone else was losing. So this decadent kind of moral decay that was happening here. And this is important as well for other people to realize that in Germany, the artists were very much anti-Nazi. They were kind of very much a unified front. And there are lots of artists, fantastic artists, maybe not as great as Gross, who also documented this particular time period. But one of the interesting things is he noted to himself that he had a business-like dedication to observing people and drawing them. He took it upon himself to really rigorously observe. So these characters feel real. They feel like they come from people who existed. Yeah, they have a kind of a life. These lines and marks, as simple as they are evocative of the real. And this is also this property of drawing, which is particularly interesting to explore. As we move forward, much farther forward, we have comics exploring issues of the day. Joe Sacco is a journalist. He studied journalism at Columbia University and then started creating his own comics. Clearly, he was good at drawing because he just kind of went from a journalism degree straight to comics. But they're incredibly detailed works. He includes himself in it. It's essentially the work of a journalist going, finding stories, talking to people, piecing together a narrative. But in so doing, we have also very difficult subjects explored through drawing, which surprisingly works very well because we start to think in a much more universal way. Although the drawing is always specific, and as previously pointed, is about evoking the kind of explicitness of something. It also always points to wider aspects of human nature or human behavior, good and bad. So the comic consciously, simultaneously, conveys simultaneously the way other forms cannot, in expressing trauma's non-linear temporal effects for terrorized witnesses, and also in expressing the ongoing presence of the past. Again, this idea that drawing doesn't sit comfortably in any time period. We re-perform the work when we look at it, which is in the now. We understand the subject, which is of a specific time. But at the same time, when we revisit it, if we turn the page, so to speak, come back to it, we're also kind of revisiting this history of this image, the history of our looking. So there's something both always contemporary, always about the subject, and then always kind of timeless aspect to drawing. So the drawing enables a kind of concurrent dialogue between now and then, between the immediacy of its forms and our reception of them. A few examples of, again, this is drawing, but it's drawing in a kind of stylistic way. When you work on a graphic novel, which I've worked on a couple, you set into a reality, you create the rules of that reality, the rules of depiction, how people look in that space, how buildings look in that space, clothing, and you then pursue a kind of narrative that is in throughout, that operates within those kind of aesthetic and stylistic rules, so to speak. But drawing, like if Mouse, I'm not sure if anybody has ever read Mouse, but it is well worth reading, and it is probably not even close to what you thought it would be, because when I read Mouse, I thought it was a Holocaust memoir, and it was like, okay, but it's much more than that, and it's much stranger and more like life, more complicated and disturbing in some ways than that. So it's a very, very interesting read. It would be very difficult to make a film around that because some of the subject matter is really particularly horrific. But with these anthropomorphic characterizations, we can enter this space, feel the humanity of it, but not really be distracted by our bodily connection to it. So drawing in some way gives us this sort of healthy distance to experience all of those kind of human and humane things that we would experience in a photograph, but through the rules, through these stylistic rules, which also give us a kind of healthy distance, and a kind of interpretive lens as well. So we have also Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is fantastic. I saw her speak as well. She's a remarkably intelligent person, and how she talks about this sort of making, her experience and what went into making Persepolis is really phenomenal. So if you have a chance to read Persepolis, I highly recommend it. And then Fun Home, Alison Bechdel, her combination of being a fantastic writer and artist is very rare. There's something really, she's just writes beautifully for the comic. But this again, very tragic, very, very tragic story, which through the comic feels very kind of humanized. And because it's the artist herself, she is in this memoir. It is her that this story is about, kind of adds as a certain level of weight as well. Contemporary artists who are using drawing to different ends. William Kentridge is a particularly interesting artist on this front. He speaks and writes beautifully about drawing, so I won't attempt to kind of replicate any of that, but I will summarize a little bit of what he's doing in this work. He does large-scale animations. They're not always animated drawings. He's a very prolific artist, but he's very playful with drawing and his subjects. he insists that he doesn't plan anything, that he's very much in the moment, and a lot of the narratives kind of emerge from ideas that come as he's making, which is also something which is part of the drawing process, which is these momentary, these things, these shifts that kind of happen in attention, which you can attend to in drawing in ways that if you're maybe using something mechanical might be a little bit more difficult. Although I suppose with shutter speeds as they are, you probably could actually, you could move with those ideas. But Kentridge really is utilizing drawing and charcoal to show the temporality, both of the material, the temporal nature of charcoal, which is essentially sort of dust on a page, but also of time and shifts in time, and really using this white male figure, which is very much him, which he uses all the time in his work, stands in for this kind of colonial presence, but also this kind of bureaucracy, the way that maybe the banality of evil, you could say, but the way that bureaucracies govern political institutions which are deeply unfair. In this case, apartheid in South Africa. And yeah, so this is a big part of the way that he's working. This is aspects of his work and the way he's using and thinking about drawing to kind of elicit our own sense of our own the temporal nature of human beings, but also the temporal nature of politics as well, and probably how stupid and mundane this kind of bureaucracy is. That after all, these kind of, an evil political system fundamentally is really about accounting, making phone calls, checking, so there's something also quite profound on that level as well. Drawing in independent animation has also really, really pushed the way that we can explore the subconscious. Susan Pitt's film Asparagus, again, if you haven't seen it, this is a real wild ride. Really pushing how drawing can build strange and disturbing worlds, and also how in this space drawing can really be a place for a smaller audience. Independent animation isn't made for everybody, so it can indulge in more kind of subterranean aspects of the human psyche. So this is also a kind of important place. A kind of drawing can enable this bigger playground for ideas. I have to mention this one. I might have a slightly unpopular opinion on this, but with the Charlie Hebdo massacre as well, we also saw the power of drawing, the power of the cartoon to offend and to provoke violence. So this is probably one of the most explosive and consequential kind of cartoons of the 21st century. But really my take on this as well is to recognize and to appreciate the power of representation. You also have to recognize the responsibility of the artist to use his or her powers with consideration of the effects of visual language or visual representation, basically. So when this happened, of course, obviously people being murdered is absolutely horrendous and terrible. But it really split the artist community. But a lot of artists really, especially American artists, came down on the side of free speech or nothing. There has to be kind of free speech. We have to maintain that that Charlie Hebdo had the right to do what they did. And this is Art Spiegelman talking here. When religion overlaps with social and political issues, it's necessary to fight back. So Charlie is equally hard on Jews, including anti-Semitic caricatures and quotes when talking about Israel. He said the equal opportunity insult that came with Charlie Hebdo was the reason it's estimable. This is Art Spiegelman. For me, that seems like a slightly strange way of justifying kind of the work by basically saying it's equal opportunity racism and ethnic insensitivity. So But this is where drawing becomes and representation becomes very powerful, but also very strange. It is strange to imagine being, horrifically offended by a cartoon, but the cartoon and representation is power, particularly when it is done with intent, and particularly when it has a wide distribution. I had no idea that Charlie Hebdo sold as many copies as it did on a weekly basis. Um, Upwards of 700,000. And I think its largest print run was something like 4 million or something. It's insane. So it was there. So now moving towards the end here. I went to Calais about a month and a half ago to explore the migrant crisis, basically. Um, and I did it just through drawing. I used no photographic reference whatsoever. Um, and nor did I really have much of a plan or idea of what the hell I was doing, basically, other than meeting with an artist friend of mine who lives in Calais, Loop Blaster, who worked in the jungle, which is the previous site of the migrant crisis for a very long time, and still works. Her studio is actually in a charity that helps migrants with documentation and so on and so forth. And she told myself and a kind of friend who was on this trip as well, where we might find the new departure point. But before that, we walked around the town and looking at monuments, looking at how French society, this could also be English society as well, memorializes its own suffering, memorializes its own sort of victories, its own strife, its own kind of role in history. And what I realized in the light of, in Calais, multiple groups of migrants were just wandering around, waiting to get on trains or buses to get to the departure point. And there is a human tragedy unfolding in front of everyone's eyes, basically here. But in these monuments, you have held these kind of these ideas of that suffering is in the past, that suffering is ours, and we own it. So this idea came to me, this idea of the supremacy of suffering. And one of the things that drawing kind of affords, probably a little bit like documentary photography, is that a lot of the ideas can be emergent, that you can't prescribe, you can't envision what you're going to encounter beforehand. You have to just go and encounter. And with drawing, a lot of it is about musings, things that just sort of come, and you start drawing something that might be compelling, and then you start thinking actually about the connections between it and the very reason that you're there. So in drawing, we take and then give anew, a couple of Susan Sontag kind of quotes here. To be involved with a work of art is detach yourself from the world. We're detaching ourselves from the world so that we can actually attach to the kind of the logic and the world of the drawing that we kind of enter and perform. So it's an act of showing or recording or witnessing which gives palpable form to consciousness. Its object is to make something singular and explicit. So what we're really seeing is the kind of manifestation of witness, of human perception, but also a kind of consciousness that's there, that's happening. And it's quite mysterious. It's even still mysterious to me. You do a drawing and you kind of look back at it, and it still speaks to you. It's like you can't really, I could never really control the things that happen on the page. It's quite bizarre, to be honest, sometimes occasionally spooky. So art both abolishes the world and encounters it in an extraordinarily intense and specialized way. So this is the migrant crisis in pictures. And what we've seen is that in pictures and video, mostly photos though, actually, in right-wing press primarily, is this objectification of people, this kind of the mass becomes a cluster, a kind of faceless mass of people coming in, sort of invaders. This could be a boat of invaders. These are all ways that these images have been reframed for the public, and how we are supposed to kind of receive them. We're supposed to not pity the people who are on these incredibly dangerous boats, but we are supposed to see them as coming to take away the limited resources that we have. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. So walking around Calais, you also, again, through drawing, starting to think about the residents of Calais that are probably from, the Middle East. The biggest majority of migrants are really coming from Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, and Afghanistan. So you got really those four countries, but you would see residents in the town that are kind of from these areas who've actually have made it. They've integrated into society. They may have been here for some time. But there's also scenes like this at an SNCF station, where we have at the bottom, you'll see a few aid workers who are helping people out with different documentation, giving them flyers which have a QR code so that they can be tracked when they're in the channel, so that they can also send distress signals to the authorities. And in some cases, we saw people getting life jackets as well from aid organizations. But this large group of humanity just there waiting was really quite powerful. This was one of the first things that we actually saw. So the migrant crisis is still in Calais, but everyone in Calais is on their way to the departure point. Typically, people only spend 48 hours, which is completely shocking, in this zone before they are attempting a crossing. So you can just imagine how many people are actually attempting this crossing on a daily basis. And other things that really came to mind was this idea of this waste, the waste of time, the waste of young people's energies, efforts, abilities, potential, all of that, but waiting. And drawing kind of waiting around young men, a lot of young men, not all. I'd say I only saw 2 children, thankfully. But unfortunately, according to the statistics, there's quite a few more children than that. But yeah, this real waste of time and resource in these young men, just kind of hanging around. And really, they have very little, if nothing. Truly, what they have on their backs is about it. And exploring the humanity there, drawing it kind of gives us this other window. The problem with drawing is that stylistically and aesthetically, there is sophistication that the artist doesn't always see. And perhaps that's a barrier to certain types of viewership, kind of getting why maybe some people perceive drawing as it's maybe a little more sophisticated than other media. But I like to hope that that in the right kind of context, disseminated well, that more and more people can actually sort of attach themselves to drawing, to meaning, and to the effects of the drawing, than and in a different way than photography. We certainly in a pre-photographic reality world, people were buying into, so to speak, the drawing, perhaps in a different way. So now we go to the end here. We were told where this launching point was. We walked 7 miles through a French town after taking a short train trip. We were in a complete industrial landscape. We thought that this was insane. There's no way that we could be close. We took an Uber because we thought that if we were in this industrial landscape and we walk another 3 miles and we don't find a beach or we don't find the area, then we're screwed. We're just in the middle of nowhere. So, but we did, with an Uber, find a beach. Very, very far out, only really accessible by one road, which was a kind of a private road and sort of multiple people were asking us what the hell we were doing there, because there's lots of industry around. But there is a small beach with some French folks walking their dogs and so forth here. And then further up this beach, straight along, we started to encounter basically the first wreck. So the first shipwreck, which was a large inflatable that was punctured. Don't know if people perished, or what, but this did not survive. It was washed up on the shore. We saw lots of shoes that were on the ground, sometimes rugs that were laid out and shoes to the side, which looked like people were praying before the journey. We saw lots of shotgun shells. So the people who would get the boats ready would fire a shot to get people over these dunes and onto the boats and out into the water. The faster that they can get out the water, the better, because the French authorities don't have any jurisdiction, supposedly, once they're in the water. But using drawing to tell this story, I still don't know. I still don't know whether this is the right way, but it is a way to maybe kind of cultivate some understanding of the reality of the situation. Then we knew where the departure point was, but we didn't know where the camp was, so to speak, where people were kind of waiting behind the dunes to set off, until we got in an Uber and just drove back to Calais and we literally drove past this area, and we just could not believe our eyes. It was this enormous encampment, with some aid workers and distribution of some supplies. Although only really 2 tents, it seemed like a relatively small amount. And many, mostly men walking in a kind of strange single file on this small elevated path. Sorry, with rubbish strewn about everywhere. So, and then after all of this drawing and so forth, it occurred to me, we went to the museum earlier in the trip and realized that Rodin was actually a native of Calais. So they had many Rodin sculptures, and he was obviously a revered kind of local artistic hero there. And I saw this hand, the hand of Saint Pierre, and it stuck with me, thinking of a revered object of a single person's hand, and then all of the bodies, all of the people who transited in and out of Calais on a daily basis, in such a precarious climate, in such a precarious kind of way, taking these small boats across the channel, risking their lives. And yet in a museum, we have this venerated object of just a hand. And something about it stuck with me. And I think this is the power of drawing as a sort of tool for kind of understanding, is that these musings, these kind of ideas, when we sort of draw them, they become firmer in our minds, in our sort of psyche, and we can then start to piece together maybe a different story, maybe a different way of seeing and understanding our world, and hopefully really in a rebellious manner, critically challenging it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louis. That was absolutely fascinating. I have to say that. Oh, so many questions I have here. I was scribbling as you were talking. So I know there's quite a few people in the room, but I'm gonna use my privilege of a person who's chairing that meeting to just ask you first 2 questions, if that's okay with you. So 2 really interesting things I've noted as you were speaking was this idea of, and you kind of wrapped up with that as well, like asking whether drawing is the right tool to tell the story. And obviously you were talking to us about, you know, using different examples from the past and your own work about how drawing could be a really, really amazing tool to talk about stories which are perhaps difficult to talk about. And
Mhm.
you really use this idea of distance through the stylistic mediation. So obviously, applying a specific style of drawing, but it could, I presume, could be told about many other forms of expression. But it allows us to distance ourselves from sometimes something which is very, very painful to talk about. And I found it really interesting. I have to say that, like, when we talk about news and politics, there was a period in my life when I basically stopped watching news because I couldn't take it anymore. And obviously, as you were talking about very difficult things, really, I found it really fascinating to look at all those images. So it has it has the power to almost soften the message, if you like. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on it. It's more a kind of open question, not a very specific question, but I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about it, because I found it really fascinating, and it helps people like myself who feel sometimes overly sensitive in terms of just this kind of brutality of news and images which are used for reporting on things like that, and yet it's obviously important. So yeah, I was wondering if you can say something more about it.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, I stopped watching news for a while as well. But I think there's something in drawing, even when it is very difficult subject matter, um, that there's something ecstatic about drawing. There's something exciting about this union between or communion between your experience of the drawing and the artist's intentions that make it kind of there's an aspect of visual delight and actual delight that's occurring kind of when we look at art. So that also enables us to kind of soften or distance ourselves from some of the kind of the horrific aspects of it. One really notable example of that would be Diary of a Teenage Girl by Phoebe Glockner, which is an excellent kind of mostly comic, but there's a lot of sort of just written passages as well. And the subject matter is pretty tough. Um, and but it works it works well as a comic. And I mean, I think they did make a film. I never saw the film of it,
Mhm.
but it works well as a comic, and it's in some ways the comic enables you to explore probably some of those darker aspects of human nature than you could in other media. Be very difficult.
Mm. I just imagined, it just occurred to me how nice it would be to actually watch the news, which were all made in a form of cartoons rather than just, videos from all around the world. That would be quite interesting.
Yeah,
Maybe that's something you can do.
I'll
Uh,
try.
so another question I have before we open to the public was just really fascinating, which relates back to the idea of creative practice research. And again, throughout all the conversations I'm having with so many people about their work or about the nature of creative practice research, this idea of uncertainty and not being able to necessarily know what happens, it's just there all the time. And you said something really beautiful. You said you cannot control what's happening on the page, and you talked about this idea. Sometimes it's even surprising to you to see what you end up drawing. And you've mentioned this idea of reflecting on the process, like as you obviously create your artwork in the middle of the process, you're kind of reflecting in terms of where it takes you. Perhaps there's some other association which can lead you to something else. And again, I guess you can say the same about any other art forms, but I find it very interesting in relation, as I said, to research, because obviously when we are applying for funding, when we're applying for, or we're trying to justify what we're doing in terms of research in creative practices, it's required of us to always have some kind of clarity in terms of, well, this is what I'm trying to do, and this is what is going to be my outcome. And I found it absolutely fascinating how you're talking about your visit to Calais and how you said that you just didn't know what was going to happen. There was no plan, and the openness of just keeping your eyes open, just really being able to observe what happens, digest it in some way, and almost digest it through your creativity, if that makes sense. And again, it's we all know this is the way it works, but then how do we, from your perspective, respond to all these requirements of research when we just
Yeah,
cannot?
Yeah, I mean, I think with practice-based research, a bit like kind of what I maybe did a little bit, is that you frame the the practice itself, the affordances of, in this case, drawing, and its effects and its benefits and its sort of drawbacks and so forth. Um, and then you kind of contrast it with other media, so you see how drawing does up against its competitors, photography. People who draw are always bashing photography because it's just like because we kind of have to, it's like it's part of the job. Um, even though it's we're gonna lose, we're easily gonna lose because we can't compete, but we can try. But I think the other aspect of it, is the personal narrative. I think I, yeah, the only way I could do it is to not do any research beforehand, is to go in completely cold, because I'm going to get the best work that way if I'm exploring and discovering for the first time with my eyes and my hand. And but then you could say, well, that's part of my methodology. It's a kind of idiot's methodology of just kind of like going in cold, basically. But it is intentional, and people tend to have a kind of orientation to their work, to their drawing, to their kind of methods, an orientation to their subject, which enables them to get what they want. So if I did all this research and this, I'd be going in there and I'd have a plan, I'd have a kind of thesis, and that would make the work very contrived. And I'm not really, that wouldn't be interesting to me, and the drawings wouldn't be as evocative, or they wouldn't be as expansive, because I'm kind of seeing maybe actually I saw that, now that's the subject. That's something interesting. I might figure out why I did that later, kind of thing.
I think this is the paradox of creative practice research, because I completely agree with you. I mean, I sometimes even think that the less you know about what you're trying to do, the more creative you can be, and then the more you do, it becomes paralyzing, at least in my case. And so I'm just going to ask you another question, which is maybe to do with, how you would then support someone who wants to use their own illustration, drawings, comic arts, whatever form of drawing they are practicing. How would you encourage them and support them in developing that pathway of using that as a form of research, knowing that there is this paradox of, you cannot really plan anything in terms of, having strict research questions or directions in order to protect your creativity, but yet giving them a confidence that there's a lot of amazing stuff that can happen out of that kind of approach. And do you think there's a way to give young people who are starting with this kind of practice with enough confidence to set them for success, but yet give them some kind of sense of direction?
Yeah, I think they need to know their tribe. So I think they need to know the other people who are making work that resonates with them, but also making work that whose vernacular is similar to theirs as well, that their language and the use of language and their kind of ideas around language resonate with their kind of approaches. When you can start to map out a sort of satellite other artists who are doing those kinds of things, you can maybe, the other aspect of research, which is very important, of course, is contemporaneity, although I can never say that word, but how contemporary is the work? How relevant is it? And I think looking at any practice that we do, whether it's sculpture or drawing or whatever, is thinking about how it functions as a 21st century piece of media. So making yourself kind of conversant with what does it mean to be a media as well.
So interesting.
And so anyway.
Okay, I have plenty of questions, but let's just see if there's anyone in the room. Yes, David.
Oh, hello, and
yeah,
I think my mic's off, so I can maybe turn my camera on. I was going to say thank you very, very much for the talk. I mean, it's always interesting to hear debates surrounding realism, looking at both 20th century works from the perspective of the 21st from different practitioners. I think it's a really fascinating conversation that's going on. So I'm going to ask a really, really, because I mean, it's something that I think about a lot too. I'm going to ask a really nerdy theoretical question, but hopefully it'll provoke something that's interesting. And it's partially just because I've been recently interested in certain conversations going on across different forms of media theorists around the notion of realism, perception, and haptics, right? There's ideas that people are kind of introducing around kind of trying to redefine realism from a 21st century media kind of perspective in relation to how our current image environment has changed so much, and how certain works that may have not been thought to evoke a sense of realism before all of a sudden are for a variety of reasons, right? And one interesting aspect, and this is just coming from a nerdy film audiovisual essay that I was just watching over the weekend, but it's asking this question in terms of like, why does contemporary film not look real anymore, right? And a lot of people have started focusing on a notion of this idea of a lot of contemporary images, they look too clean, right? Like even images that people are sharing on Instagram, you know what I mean? They look too clean, they look too curated, right? And this notion of a kind of like a grit or a bit of a dirt in an image being present. And I saw that in a lot of the images you were showing, right? They felt a little bit gritty, a little bit dirty, right? And I'm just curious if you think that there's something kind of going on there in terms of the act of drawing itself, in terms of the physical process, right? Is it being kind of almost dirtier, right, in respective to other forms of image making, and whether that has a kind of is perhaps having an interesting kind of effect in terms of this relationship and in terms of your own practice as well.
No, I think that's that. In fact, it's interesting. I mention it to my students a lot because I teach character design and concept art, and I'm always trying them to getting them to take the kind of the digital gloss off their images in a way. And we also talk about this idea of video games where a kind of character has been out and in battle and done things and crawled through caves and yet comes out and they've got shiny armor and everything looks kind of fantastic.
Too clean.
And and it's kind of like,
Yeah.
no, this is like also bad design because it's also bad the narrative falls because like we're like, no, you'd be really scuffed up, you'd be kind of dirty, you'd be dusty, you'd be sweaty, you'd look kind of horrific. Um, so there's that. It's an interesting, it's a good point, and that this is also kind of falls on this idea of the construction of the image, constructed reality. A lot of social media is very much kind of constructed reality for a purpose. But I guess the other aspect of this too, which is something that happened in VR, so virtual reality, the whole thing was that you are there in a realistic environment and you're experiencing things kind of realistically. But actually, the movement in virtual reality very quickly moved away from that because they sort of realized that that's an incredibly confining use of this incredible technology to just be in reality. It's like, well, okay, you could walk out the door and you're in reality. But this, like VR, is like, well, let's be in some other aesthetic space where there's different rules and there's other strange kind of things happening. And I think the dirt of the drawing and all of that is like Michael Taussig kind of thing is saying, I was there. I was in this moment making this thing, and it's a visceral part of my kind of consciousness that's displayed on the page using really rudimentary materials. And maybe my consciousness itself is also dirty. It's not this singular thing. My brain is organic. It's got all sorts of weird veins and blood pumping through and everything. So what, in the pinnacle of this moment in this 21st century that we are, do we want to be these hyper polished beings, reflecting all this kind of hyper technology and proliferation of images which are largely kind of manipulated, or do we want to maybe kind of go back to a space where if we're not controlling our own representation or representations of reality, can we buy into people who are representing reality in maybe a way which is more real? I mean, also the problem is with the West. If you go anywhere in the global South, reality smacks you in the face, and dirt and grime and lack of clean water and everything. That's the reality of far more people than anyone in the West. So this glossy end of capitalism thing that we have going on here, or zombie capitalism, as some have mentioned it, is itself a tiny kind of fraction of really of human consumption, visual human consumption, basically. Although I do really think it's a good debate. I wonder, some colleagues have wondered if we're going to be going back to like kind of printmaking and oil painting or something like that. But I think the digital tools are too sophisticated. What I do see in the digital tools, particularly the latest kind of Procreate and things like that, is they're getting much, much better at replicating natural materials than I ever thought they would. But long live dirt, and long live maybe some sort of authentic, whatever authentic is, authentic, experience. But yeah, so I've got, yeah, so I don't know, that's the best way I could say it, I suppose.
Thank you.
Amazing. I also want to pick on another thing you talked about, which is quite interesting. So with your first part of your talk, when we were looking at different examples of different drawings from the past, it really was quite pleasing to be able to spend some time and look at a static image and just pay attention to lots of details. And it's quite interesting that you've mentioned photography so often, because I think our contemporary relation with photography is very different. Like, we all have mobile phones where we just snap bazillions of photos all the time and never pay attention to that. Whereas when you're faced with looking at a drawing, which is effectively a piece of an artwork, we actually pay a little bit more attention to what's going on there, because that's not what all of us are doing on a daily basis the same way like we do with snapping or photographs. So I think there's a very, very different relation in terms of how we're consuming the information which is there. And you also said something very interesting about drawing as a tool for understanding, and the way you talked about it made me think that you're talking both about yourself as an artist, but also us as audiences. They kind of go twofold. So you as a person who's drawing is kind of learning about how you perceive the reality around you in the process. We talked about it with my previous questions, but we also have a different opportunity to engage with all those details. And it's rather fascinating because, in many situations, people just go to a gallery or a museum to engage with drawings or other, again, forms of artworks. I'm kind of putting drawings with a kind of wider context of art, but just because I'm trying to contrast it with the question of photography and perhaps news, because obviously we're talking about using drawings in relation to looking at political or societal issues we face, which is not the obvious way for me to think about art always, even though we know that it has always been the case to some degree. But I think for many of us, you just kind of separate those things, even though you will have piece of art really responding very vividly to different situations. You feel like, well, I'm just going to engage with some kind of art. I'm going to go to a gallery and just look at beautiful things. Whereas when you look at photography or news, you think, well, I'm just going to hear about all the grim situation that is happening out there. And in your talk, you really, I just found it like, it's not that it's something new, but just the way you talk about it, I find it really, really fascinating. And then the kind of the idea of engaging in, well, I started my question with the kind of details of a static image, which is very different to photography. It was just really fascinating for me as a person who's looking at it as your audience. So I just, again, I wonder if you have any kind of reflections on that. And I know it's a convoluted question, but it's really about kind of really looking at the details of how the reception process in this kind of situation is just really provides us with a very comfortable and really pleasing way of engaging with all the rich content of what is there. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I mean, in the turn of the century, you basically had three publications in the West, actually four, if you think about Harper's in the States, you had Lascaux Aubert in France, you had Simplicissimus in Germany, and you had the Graphic in London, in the UK, and they were all, the photograph was available. It was there. It had already documented its first war, the Crimean War, and although they're not as interesting as the drawings because they, this kind of bulky apparatus, the photograph at the time. But there's plenty of photography kind of swimming around, but there's a desire by the public to have to understand society, because you're still in a kind of society, modernizing society. The people want to know what's really happening, where are the kind of disparities, how is technology kind of developing, how is trade unions, and all this kind of stuff, the messiness of getting us up and going in the 20th century, basically. Drawing really told that story. And in the 70s and 80s, it was a really high point for illustration, particularly in the States, but also here as well, where you had a lot of reportage artists documenting a variety of different things going on, in the West, and being, kind of like a documentary lens, but through drawing, basically. And in the 21st century, there's urban sketchers movement is enormous, and it's global, really genuinely global, all the way down through Africa, South America, Asia. There's people getting together on a weekly basis and drawing and sharing their drawings and uploading them and talking about them. So there is a kind of desire to see the world, to document it, to engage in that way, maybe as an antidote to a kind of mediated world where we're always kind of seeing other people's representations. No, I want to kind of contribute to this. I want to make my own. But it's also the meditative nature of drawing itself. It's very thought-inducing, and it's a very thoughtful activity when you're drawing. You're really thinking, probably like photography as well. It's kind of whenever you have some creative tool, it really gets you kind of thinking that authority that you have, or agency, but it's also authority in a sense, because you're making a lot of kind of consequential decisions. That makes a big difference. There's sort of power in there, and there's a sense of creative freedom, creative choice, and you're contributing. And I think a lot of people feel very powerless in this world. And in some ways, making art and even consuming art is a way of attaining maybe that little bit of power, a little bit of agency, and a little bit of kind of visual delight that I think we're yearning for.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And as I said, for me also, is this idea of being able to stop for a second, just look at something for a bit longer than what you're normally presented with. So that's really fascinating. So I'm aware of time. I'm aware that we coming towards the end of this talk, which is really sad, because there's so many things which I think we could still talk about. So I'm just going to ask if there's any other question in the audience. Yes.
Hi. Firstly, I just wanted to say it was a great talk. But secondly, my question was, we just very briefly mentioned this idea of art sometimes softening the blow of what we're looking at. And I was wondering if you ever felt like you had to sort of navigate this idea of not letting the art trivialize the subject that you're drawing, and even potentially not appearing biased. When you mentioned the photo, you said that sometimes newspapers pull narratives when looking at photos, like the migrants on the boat. And I was wondering if you're ever concerned that your art might be subject to bias or trivialized in some way.
Oh, completely. I mean, this is, yeah, it's definitely the problem for sure. I mean, especially with drawing, because it's kind of like, yeah, I think in some ways for me, it's often less about the way that I'm representing, because I really don't, I don't know, it's strange. I tell my students is like, if you're thinking and draw, like thinking destroys drawing in a way. I know I just going back on myself because I just said it's a very thoughtful task, but in some ways you don't really like draw and premeditate. You don't really think that way. You just sort of do it. You have to be sort of so fully in the moment. But being in the moment is looking and feeling more than it is this kind of conscious override of like your intentions. So I think the drawings themselves, I don't, I you know, yeah, I don't have that problem, but I do in terms of the subjects and the subject matter that I'm choosing, because of course that's where my intentions are so obvious. I'm choosing to draw that person. I'm choosing to draw this context and so forth, which is polluted by my own desires and own kind of commentary and own, yeah. So in that sense, it is definitely a problem. One of the interesting things, actually, my partner noted as well that there really isn't much talk in reportage drawing about ethics because drawing is so slippery and it's kind of just it's so abstract and it has always been outside the rules of photography that ethics don't really kind of come into it. But it'd be so interesting to explore this idea of drawing and reportage drawing and ethics. And I think it's still a field of my world of research that I think really needs to be explored.
That is so interesting. I was just thinking as we were talking about this amazing film I've seen this year at the Venice Film Festival, which was, there's no time to talk about it, but basically talks about atrocities of war, but in a very non-documentary way. That's all I'm gonna say, given the time we have. And I agree with you that the question of ethics is always softened when you are not dealing with explicitly documentary forms, which is very interesting, and obviously drawing, by again falling under this category of art form, it's probably escaping a lot of questions that would have been asked if it was a photography or something like that. Super interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. With the last minute to go, can I just ask what's your next project, if you have one already in your head?
Well, the Calais one will continue, but we're going to actually also explore stories of from migrants here. So we're going to go to Clacton-on-Sea, and which I've already been there. I did a book on seaside towns, so I've been to Clacton. And so, but it's interesting. It's also the home of Nigel. Well, it's Nigel Farage's actual what's it called? Where he represents the Clacton basically, and
Yeah,
it's also where
constituency.
the largest migrant facility is as well. So that probably I'm sure there's a link. But yeah, but yeah, I've got a graphic novel things, a few things in a little bit of limbo. Um, yeah, but research wise, I've got a kind of full plate of different things going. I just finished well, actually with the latest issue, a comic as research piece, and I've got another comic as research piece coming up as well. So.
Amazing. Always a pleasure to follow your work. So thank you so much, Louis, once again. There was lots of comments in the chat saying it was an absolutely fascinating talk. So I didn't have a chance to read all of them, but everyone loved it, as I obviously did. And I will make it available online as soon as I can. So once again, thank you so much for your time, and best luck with all the future work. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye
Thanks.
bye.
Bye.